Good evening. My name is Alyssa Pacey, and I am the archivist here at the library. I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's program. We are really excited to be offering this program this evening, and I, for one, am really looking forward to hearing everyone's talk. This is the sixth lecture in our Washington and American Memory series, organized by the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, with support from History Cambridge, the Cambridge Public Library, and Gavin Cleespies. This speaker series is made possible through the generous support of America's National Parks, a nonprofit partner of the National Park Service. Our next and final lecture in our series is How We Remember What We Preserve, Washington's Legacy at Mount Vernon, with Doug Bradburn and Andrea Sahin. This talk is happening on Monday, April 27th at 6 p.m. This will be a hybrid lecture, and you can register on the library's website or at Longfellow House, Washington headquarters website as well. Lastly, tonight's talk will be recorded. The video will be available tomorrow, and we will send out a link to those who registered. So, for tonight's program, I'm going to give a brief introduction to our three panelists, and then Kyera Singleton will come up and give a brief intro, and both Kelli and John will come up and give a presentation, and then the three will sit down for a panel discussion. So now I am delighted to introduce you to tonight's speakers. Kyera Singleton is the Executive Director of the Royall House and Slave Quarters in Medford, Massachusetts, and is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Humanities, Slavery, Colonialism, and Their Legacies at Tufts Initiative. She earned a PhD in American Culture from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, in 2004. She is a recent American Democracy Fellow in the Charles Warren Center at Harvard University, has held several prestigious academic fellowships, and from 2018 through 2019, she served as the Humanity in Action Policy Fellow for the ACLU of Georgia. John Garrison Marks is the author of the new book, Thy Will Be Done, George Washington's Legacy of Slavery and the Fight for American Memory. And he is the Vice President of Research and Engagement at the American Association for State and Local History. A historian, public history researcher, and writer, John holds a PhD in history from Rice University. His first book, Black Freedom in the Age of Slavery, Race, Status, and Identity in the Urban Americas, was published in 2020 and explored the lives of free people of color in South Carolina and Colombia. John's new book, Thy Will Be Done, is available for purchase after this evening's talk. So we've secured a pre-publication book, a bunch of books, so make sure you get your copy because it's not officially out for a few more days. And finally, Kelli Racine Barnes is an American Conservation Experience Mellon Humanities Postdoctoral Fellow, whose scholarly interests include 18th and 19th century United States, Black American girlhood, transatlantic material culture, and exhibit design. She earned her PhD in history and a certificate in museum studies from the University of Delaware, where she was an African American public humanities fellow. Her dissertation, Quotidian Resistance, Black Girls, Their Girlhood Embroideries, and the History of Education in Northeastern United States, 1789 to 1852, is an interdisciplinary examination of the experiences of Black girls during this period. All right, Kyera, I'd like to welcome you to the stage. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. So I am just going to give a few brief Some very brief remarks about Washington's time in the area to segue into what you all are here to see tonight, which is presentations by both John and Kelli. So first, I'd like to thank the Longfellow House and especially Emily Levine for organizing this fantastic event today. I'm very excited to be in conversation with John and Kelli. When Washington arrived in Boston, he arrived to a city that was occupied by the British. Scholars estimate that there were some 11,000 British soldiers in Boston. And he arrived to a city full of agitated and battle-tested colonists, many of whom were determined to no longer live under the rules of the royal government. As tensions increased, and after the Battle of Bunker Hill, Washington was elected as the head of the Continental Army to direct the siege of Boston. With the British occupying Boston and controlling the waterways, Washington was determined to cut off their usage of the harbor. In order to do that, he launched an attack in the Dorchester Heights on March 4th, 1776. And in addition, he commanded the troops stationed in Cambridge to also attack the British forces there. Both of these moves were strategic in Washington's quest to, and I quote, bring the enemy out of Boston. But there was also a little luck on his side. And that luck was, believe it or not, snow. A snowstorm prevented the British Army from trying to launch a successful counterattack at Dorchester Heights. Unable to maintain a foothold in a major port, the British left Boston on March 17 of 1776, which we now celebrate as Evacuation Day. This key battle is part of the reason why Washington is so celebrated in the area. And in fact, there is not a historical site or museum who does not try to claim that Washington visited their site. I mean, I'm at the Royal House and Slave Quarters, and we have a story that Washington once interrogated soldiers in the main bedroom in the mansion. So I think with that said, that victory was not only a crucial turning point in the war, but also it added to the larger-than-life symbol of Washington as a shrewd military official and as the person that ushered America into a nation. With that said, the memory of George Washington and the celebration of him often erases his history as an enslaver. He enslaved more people than many of his peers, but also freed over 120 people from slavery at the end of his life. Despite any conflicting feelings he had over slavery, he also went out of his way to relentlessly attempt to track down on a judge and enslaved women who fled from the president's house in Philadelphia. So how do we hold these two things together? More importantly, how do we ensure that the myth, memory, and symbolism that surrounds Washington does not overshadow the Black women, men, and children who he enslaved and who also sought to make the world anew through a long history of abolition and activism? Luckily, we have two experts who are going to help us contend with that history so that we can better understand and complicate Washington's legacy today. Thank you.
So, thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you to Kyera and to the Cambridge Public Library, to NPS Longfellow House, and to the generous support of all program sponsors. And before I go any further, I want to share that I am a person who stutters. Sometimes I have flow, sometimes I don't, but I share this to ease my own nerves. So I thank you for your time and attention to my presentation. And before I get into it, I would like to also acknowledge that I am standing on the ancestral homelands of the Namkayag, Massachusetts, and Pawtucket people, and presenting about the ancestral homelands of the Lenape people where they have thrived, where they have all thrived for countless generations. I would also like to acknowledge the presence and labor of people of African descent who were enslaved on, worked, freed, and enjoyed the land that we are on. I'm here because of and pay respect to all of my elders, African, Indigenous, and European. And in the next 20 minutes, I will briefly explain the reason for my ACE Mellon Humanities Postdoctoral Fellowship, formerly with the National Park Service and Independence National Historical Park in Philadelphia. I will share a little bit about my fellowship project, Invisible Architects of Freedom, African Americans in Early Philadelphia, now at nps.org, which was co-created with the School District of Philadelphia. And finally, I will share the current research and the context around the creation of a second map for 1790s Philadelphia, which will detail the many free and enslaved individuals who lived on the land of the park around the time of George, Martha, Ona, Paris, Hercules, Christopher, Mole, Austin, Joe, Richmond, Giles, and many more, many others, and I like to say their names, who occupied what we now call the President's House at 6th and Market Street in Philadelphia. To begin, as a Mellon Humanities Postdoctoral Fellow, I was one of 35 who were partnered with the National Park Service sites nationwide to prepare for the 250th commemoration of the signing of the Declaration of Independence this year. I was based at the park in Philadelphia from August 2023 until the grant agreement was terminated by the federal government in April 2025. I am thankful to ACE and to Mellon for stepping in and also extending my fellowship an additional 9 months through May of this year. My fellowship project at Indy was titled The Nation's Origin Story, with a focus on African American studies. And my research was on the Black American experience on the land of the park and in the surrounding community, bringing back in the Black community themselves that's currently in Philadelphia. And this research builds on my dissertation research, as you heard very briefly, on Black schoolgirls, because 3 of the ones who I looked at went to schools in Philadelphia when they stitched their needlework. And in addition, it is built on the genealogical research of my own family that has been done into one branch on my mother's side. So far, we have been able to research back to ancestors who were born as free Black Philadelphians in the early 1800s. So I am at least a 7th generation Black Philadelphian, and it could be further back, but we don't know yet. And therefore, my earlier ancestors were either free or enslaved, and quite possibly walked the same streets of old Philadelphia when George Washington was president, and Ona and others were living in the city in the 1790s. My fellowship project came together after conversations with Ishmael Jimenez, the social studies curriculum director for the School District of Philadelphia. They were in the midst of planning curriculum on early Black Philadelphia for 2026 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Negro History Week, which is now known as Black History Month under Dr. Carter G. Woodson, and also the 20th anniversary of African American Studies being a graduation requirement in the district. And the teachers expressed a need for historical sources to assist them in the classrooms. We therefore decided to collaborate on the creation of this digital archive to contribute to the teacher's toolkit to teach students about early Black Philadelphia. The archive serves as a central digital location for free, easy to access primary sources, a map, timeline, primary source analysis worksheets, a self-guided walking tour, and a bibliography. The sources include letters, posters, petitions, buildings, artwork, and other items related to the park and the surrounding community, dating from first encounters through 1900. And I'm including here the QR code on screen for anyone who would be interested in visiting the site at a later time. This project brings into focus the Black residents of Philadelphia during the formation of the nation and how they were interpreting, responding, and utilizing the concepts of revolution, freedom, and independence to improve the lives of their new homeland. And I don't have time to go into it now, but one of the things that the teachers request was for every primary source to have a short description. So if they or their students came to the site, they would know in 3 to 5 sentences what the primary source was and why it was important and the context around it for early Black Philadelphia, which you will see if you visit the site. So currently there are 2 maps in the digital archive. This first one was created to show the research thus far on Black American people who were residing on or present in the 1770s. Basically the park, especially the park rangers, were interested in learning more about the enslaved women and men who may have traveled, lodged, and worked with the signers when they came to the city for the various conventions. So for instance, each dot you see here, if you hover over it, you see a person's name, and then if you click on it, you see a box pop up, and for each one, it gives a short description about who that person was, their occupation, their date of residence, the historic and modern address, and a brief biography about them. And I tried to also link out to any other NPS sites especially, but others as well, who also give more in-depth information on their sites about that person. And then the second map was originally created as a walking tour for teachers when they visited the site, the park, in October of 2024 for a professional development day. Everyone enjoyed it so much that it was added to the digital archive and then reintroduced to the general public in the Visitor Center for Black History Month of February 2025 for anyone else who wished to take this tour on their own when they visited the park. So the third idea I had was to create a map showing the vast array of Black Americans who lived as free and enslaved people on the park, on the land of the park and in the neighborhoods around the President's House in the 1790s. And this time, the 1780s and 1790s are 2 very important decades to note following the devastation of the Revolutionary War. The African American community began to grow again, building schools and churches and beneficial societies, such as the Free African Society in 1787, started by Absalom Jones, Richard Allen, and several others. And additionally, the ethnic diversity of the city changed during the passing of the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780. Pennsylvania was the first in North America to pass a law to prohibit the importation of enslaved people into the state, ruled that any person born after March 1780 would enter indentured servitude and be emancipated once they reached 28 years old. They required the registering and the fee of $2 per person for enslaved people bound for life or until 31 years old by November 1st of 1780, or they would be deemed free persons. And this is the law that would become a thorn in the side of the Washingtons once they moved to Philadelphia, which I will talk more about later, and I'm sure you'll hear more about from John. I also want to note that this is along with the Gradual Abolition Act, it worked in tandem with the Philadelphia yearly meeting that had been encouraging Quaker enslavers, at least since the 1750s, to manumit the people that they held in bondage. And that was formally, but there were people before that also encouraged the manumission of enslaved people. And I want to note here that for the sake of understanding how the population grew, prior to the revolution in 1787, there were 1,400 enslaved people living and working in the city. And about 8 years or so later, there were 700 enslaved people. So the number was cut in half, due in part, I believe, to the abolitionist sentiments that were growing in the city. And by 1783, another 8 years later, approximately 400 enslaved people remained in the city, according to scholars. And by the 1790 census, the federal census, there were approximately 2,150 free persons of color and 384 enslaved people remaining in the city. And over the course of the 1790s, this number of enslaved people continued to decline, and overall the population of free people climbed to be over 6,400 by 1800. In the midst of it all, General George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States. I'm going to skip this. In 1789, and over the course of that year, George, his wife Martha, their grandchildren Eleanor and George, Part Custis, Tobias Lear, and other staff members, white and free black paid servants, as well as several enslaved individuals, including Christopher Shields, who many believe it may be the person who was painted here in this portrait, all transitioned to the president's house in New York City. And in the midst of that, we have to keep in mind, too, that these enslaved members in particular left behind their family and friends, husbands, wives, children at Mount Vernon in Virginia. Then at the beginning of 1790, it is believed that Congress began to debate and signed into law the Residence Act. This act established Philadelphia as a temporary capital for 10 years while the District of Columbia and the White House was being built on the banks of the Potomac River. This act was a compromise, placing the capital somewhere in the middle between what some considered the abolitionist-minded North and the slaveholding states of the South. Robert Morris, a merchant also known as the American Revolutionary War financier, offered his mansion at 6th and High Street, as it was then known, to the president and his family and staff in Philadelphia. Thus, in 1790, they packed up and they moved once again to Philadelphia, a block away from the State House. By this time, Philadelphia was already an important political and financial center for the nation due to the American Revolution. It could also tout as being the largest metropolitan area with a growing African American community. And that would include the people who moved into the president's house, joining the community of African Americans already in the city. Ona Marie, who was a lady's maid to Martha and a seamstress, Mole, who was a nursemaid to the children and a seamstress, Christopher Shields, who was a personal valet, Hercules, the chief chef, Joe, later taking the name Richardson, was a footman, Paris was a stable hand and driver, Austin, Ona's brother, was a postilion and stable hand, Giles was a footman, driver, and postilion, and Richmond, Hercules' son, was a scullion in the kitchen, and Aaron's boy, as they called, and he was young, and a chimney sweep. They all would have lived amongst and walked the streets of Philadelphia, interacting with, shopping in the same markets, chatting with, overhearing gossip and news, and likely worshiping with free black individuals, as well as other enslaved individuals, free and indentured European Americans, and recent European immigrants, predominantly from Ireland and the area that we now know today as Germany, all settling into the city at the same time. But now, due to the Gradual Abolition Act, we know that between April 12th and the 24th in 1791, George corresponded with his secretary Tobias Lear and spoke to Martha to determine if and how they would invade the law. They decided to rotate people between Mount Vernon and Philadelphia, or to visit out-of-state friends before the 6-month window for the various people was over. And in doing so, the Washingtons would not have to free the enslaved individuals within their household, nor, if the enslaved individuals knew of the law, could they legally seek their freedom for being in the state for longer than 6 months. Nonetheless, we know that people enslaved in Washington's household pushed back. Ona sought her freedom in 1796. Hercules sought his freedom in 1797. And back in Virginia, right before George's death, Christopher Shields and his fiancée attempted to escape in 1799. When Ona Marie Judge walked out of Washington's house, she was assisted by the African American community around her. And we know more about this community because of the research conducted by Doctors Billy Smith and Paul Sivitz with their team for their Mapping Historic Philadelphia, Recreating Life in America's First City project in 2012. They created several maps based on tax lists, census records, and city directories from 1789 to 1791, highlighting the number of African American heads of households, as pictured here in this detail, as well as other maps. For instance, one with the location of enslavers in the city during this time period. Therefore, my final mapping project is to locate and name the free Black individuals who lived all around Ona Marie, Austin, and others on the land of the park, free and enslaved. And this project will build on the data and the research Smith and Sivitz team has conducted. I have combed through the existing data and pulled out the names, occupations, addresses, and other pertinent information of all African American heads of households and enslavers with free and enslaved people within their households on the land of the park and in the surrounding community. And before I end, I thought I would share just a few bits of data that I found to be pretty interesting. Of the 121 heads of households that I found, 46 are Black Americans. Of those 46, unfortunately, only 10 listed their occupations: a tavern keeper, 2 milliners, a grocery and fruit peddler, a baker, a carpenter, a journeyman, 2 laborers, and a boarding house keeper. And what I also found interesting that I did not add to this slide, there was a Mrs. Cadwalladers that was listed as a spinster, and a Mary Hudson who was listed as a gentlewoman. So I'm very curious about them, and will probably take a little bit of time, side project, and learn more about them as well. Also, most of the 75 white European American heads of household had either free people of color or enslaved people within their households, with the exception of 5 who had a combination of both. As scholars have often noted about the solitary daily lives of free and enslaved domestic workers in urban settings, of these 70 households, one or the other, there were between 1 and 3 free people of color in those households, with 2 outliers. For some reason, the cord waiters and shoemakers had like 4, 5, 6 free people of color in their households as well. And in the households with enslaved people, there were again 1 to 3 enslaved people, with the outlier of John Lawrence Esquire, who lived at 155 Chestnut, who had 6 enslaved people. So next, I would like to plot these people on a map, as I did for the one for nps.gov. And I believe that this will help us to name the people who lived around the president's house, and future research could delve into these specific people, who they were, their contributions to society where they worshiped, and their genealogy. But as for right now, as our history is being vandalized and rewritten and erased, this research, data, and map will acknowledge and continue to reiterate the presence, the community, and the contributions of free and enslaved people of African descent to the financial and political capital that Philadelphia was during the late 18th century. And I thank you. And these are a few of the people who have helped me along the way that I would be remiss if I did not also share in thanking as well.
All right, let me see if I can get this changed over real quick. Hi, everyone. I'm John Marks. I'm incredibly excited to be here. I really can't explain how excited I am. Today is the first time I've seen a big stack of my books on a table. It comes out next week. I've been working on this project for 6 years or so now. So to finally have a chance to come and speak to an audience about it and see the books and hold them in my hands is really exciting. I want to extend my thanks, like Kelli said, to the library, to Longfellow House, all the program sponsors, to Kelli, to Kyera, and it's really an honor to be here and get to speak with you all about Washington and his legacy of slavery. So I'll say just a little bit about the art that is on the slide and on the cover of my book. It is by an artist named Titus Kaffar, who also had a piece in Kelly's slideshow, and it is a very traditional portrait of Washington, but over top is the runaway advertisement that Washington placed trying to recapture Ona Judge, who had emancipated herself from enslavement to the Washingtons. And if you see this in person, it's on exhibit at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts right now. It's three-dimensional. It's a mixed media piece. So it is a document that's shredded and nailed over top of this portrait of Washington. Really, to me, doing kind of in one image what I take 100,000 words or so to do, which is to ask us, how would we see Washington differently if we put his history of slavery front and center? So I love this piece, and I'm really glad that I got to use it as the cover of my book. But I want to start tonight with a scene from Portland, Oregon. This was in June of 2020, as there were demonstrations for racial justice all around the country. And in Portland and in other cities, a lot of those protests came to focus on George Washington and statues of George Washington. This one in particular was erected in 1926 for the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But for protesters in the summer of 2020, it really becomes this symbol of the deep roots of racial injustice in the United States. And so just after midnight on June 19th, they throw ropes around the statue and they yank it to the ground. As you can see in the photo, they cover it in graffiti, things like 1619 and slave owner. And the next day, once you could finally see the damage, a journalist talks to a resident of Portland who summed it up perfectly by telling the journalist, yeah, he's the founder of the country, but 300 slaves is a lot of slaves. That summer, you have similar scenes that are taking place all over the United States. In these demonstrations, people are aiming their focus directly at Washington as this symbol of the ways that slavery and racial oppression are built into the very foundations of the United States. And for these protesters and demonstrators, no one symbolizes that those deep roots better than Washington. And so they put graffiti on statues of Washington. They douse him in red paint. They write things like slave master and 1619 and God bless America with 3 Ks. He really becomes this point of focus for these demonstrations. Other places, even when statues aren't defaced, right, they are, you have local officials considering whether they need to add more context to these monuments, whether they should be moved to museums where they can be better interpreted. But this is something that is happening in communities all throughout the country in the summer of 2020. The New York Times columnist Charles Blow, I think, sort of summed it up and spoke to the kind of general tenor of these demonstrations that summer when he said in a piece titled, "Yes, Even George Washington," he says, "On the issue of American slavery, I am an absolutist. Enslavers were amoral monsters. Slave owners should not be honored with monuments in public spaces." So this is the kind of unequivocal tone that people are taking with Washington in the summer of 2020. Predictably, there is immediate blowback, this kind of reaction from conservatives who don't want to see the history of slavery being put front and center in our discussions of Washington. So Kayleigh McEnany, the press secretary during the first Trump administration, says that Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser ought to be ashamed for suggesting that some of these monuments deserve more context. Conservative provocateur Dinesh D'Souza kind of drums up this claim on Facebook that liberals are trying to take down the Washington Monument, the world's tallest stone structure, and says that leftists are trying to erase history so they can rewrite it as they see fit. You see this kind of blowback happening in a lot of different places in conservative media. And I think what we've seen more recently, as Kelli mentioned or alluded to at the President's House site in Philadelphia, the removal of the exhibit telling the stories of the people Washington enslaved there, to me, is still kind of a continuation of that reactionary moment, right? It is pushing back on this idea that discussing the history of slavery is an essential part to understanding George Washington's history. And I think for a lot of people, over the course of the last 4 years, the controversies around Washington and slavery, the vitriol of these debates has really felt unprecedented. But what I'm going to talk about tonight and what I talk about in my book is that it wasn't. In fact, these things have really deep roots in American history. We have struggled for more than 2 centuries, for nearly 250 years now, to understand how we should place slavery when we talk about Washington's legacy, to reckon with Washington's involvement in the institution of slavery, right? On the one hand, Washington is one of the most prolific enslavers in American history. By the time he dies in 1799, there are more than 300 people enslaved at Mount Vernon. And yet he is also the architect of one of the largest private emancipations in American history. He emancipates 123 people from slavery, a step that none of the other founding fathers who enslaved people took. And these debates about Washington, about how to understand this conflicted history, have really shaped and reshaped our collective memory of Washington over time, and has made that memory really contested. I think the stories that I tell in the book and the research that I've uncovered really makes clear that Americans have always viewed our history not just as a window into another time, but also as a mirror that reflects our own. And today's controversies about Washington, today's controversies about our history, are really profoundly shaped by that history in ways that we don't often recognize and don't often understand. And that's the history that I explore in my book and that I'll share a little bit of this evening. So despite people who might like to claim otherwise, Washington's relationship with slavery was really complicated. He was actively involved in the institution of slavery for his entire adult life. He inherits the first people he enslaves at age 11, comes into his ownership of them at 18, and he enslaves people until the day that he dies. He's not a passive holder of slaves, right? He is actively and intimately involved in every aspect of the institution. He is buying and selling human beings as property. He is directing their punishment, sometimes punishing them himself. He is relentlessly pursuing those who try to emancipate themselves, and he does all of this right up until the very end. He is, very, very actively involved in enslavement. In 1797, 2 years before he dies, while serving as president, he writes a letter back to his plantation manager at Mount Vernon, who's sending him reports, updating him about the work of the people he enslaved. And Washington writes to him and says, if the Negro will not do their duty by fair means, they must be compelled to do it. And I think we all understand what compelling enslaved people to do that work entails. And yet, he is also, at the very same moment, writing privately to people about his opposition to the institution of slavery and about his hope that slavery will be abolished in the United States. So in 1786, he writes a letter to Robert Morris that gets quoted again and again throughout our history and says, "There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." He expresses his wish to see Congress adopt some measure, quote, "by which slavery in this country may be abolished by slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees." Again, he writes to the Marquis de Lafayette, who is urging Washington to free the people that he enslaves. And Washington writes to him and says that ending slavery gradually in the United States would help the nation avoid, quote, much inconvenience and mischief. Then, finally, in one of the last acts of his life, literally on his deathbed, Washington frees the people that he enslaves and owns outright at Mount Vernon. Without getting dragged too deep into 18th century property law, about a little more than half of the people who were enslaved at Mount Vernon were owned by the estate of Martha Washington's first husband. So George Washington controls them while he's alive, but doesn't have legal ownership of them. But 123 people that he does own outright, he says will be free after his death and Martha Washington's death. And so he frees 123 people from slavery. And this is a massive number and massively reshapes the free black community of Fairfax County, Virginia. Within a few weeks, everyone in America knows that Washington did this. The first person to share the news was actually Richard Allen in Philadelphia. He tells his congregation of enslaved and free black worshipers that they have cause to mourn Washington's death. He says Washington was not insensible to our sufferings. He believed that African Americans deserved liberty. And so Allen is telling his congregation they should be mourning the death of Washington. And his will gets republished throughout the country in newspapers, in pamphlets, in early biographies in the months after Washington's death. But I think it's important to remember that this is not a story of kind of gradual redemption, right? This isn't about Washington being born into a system in which slavery is the norm, and then he leads a revolution dedicated to the principles of liberty and equality, and then he finally, in the end, redeems himself by freeing the people he enslaved. He is holding both of these things together somehow at the very same time, right? He is writing about the people that he enslaves and how they should be treated, talking about compelling them to work, even while he's writing about his support for gradual abolition and his desire to kind of extricate himself from the slave system. At the very same time that he is writing to people about how much he supports Pennsylvania's 1780 gradual abolition law, how he hopes Virginia will adopt something similar, he is actively scheming to undermine that law and make sure the people that he personally enslaved couldn't take advantage of it. These are views that he never reconciled during his lifetime, and we have struggled ever since to reconcile as well. Since Washington's death, Americans have been selectively citing his history with slavery, lifting up his enslavement, or praising him for emancipating the people he enslaved, or ignoring it altogether, to suit the needs of their political and cultural moments. And so the book explores those uses and manipulations of Washington's complex and ambiguous history with slavery. And I'm going to take time to share just one example from one chapter of the book here this evening. And so I want to talk about how Washington's name and legacy gets invoked during the fight over slavery in the lead up to the Civil War. And this is one of the most clear and I think illustrative examples that I could draw out on how many people are using Washington's involvement with slavery to try to make the point that Washington would support their views and would support what they are doing. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery speakers and activists in the middle of the 19th century are all invoking Washington and saying that Washington's history with slavery supports their viewpoint. For abolitionists in particular, they don't all agree on how they should cite Washington. Some are citing his emancipation of the people that he enslaved, saying if Washington saw fit to free his slaves, what could be more American than ending slavery? Others are ruthlessly criticizing Washington for his involvement in slavery as a way of making clear how deep the roots of slavery and racial injustice go, how woven into the foundations of the United States they really are. So a few examples of this. In 1838, John Quincy Adams, this is after he's served as president, he returns to serve in Congress representing Massachusetts. He is lifting up this kind of anti-slavery Washington. So he is speaking to an anti-slavery rally here in Massachusetts, and in 1838, he tells the crowd, quote, "The slaveholders of the present day vainly resort to Washington's example as authority for holding slaves, but his authority is directly and most pointedly against them." And he continues and says, "George Washington was, in the broadest and most comprehensive sense of the word, an abolitionist." Quincy Adams goes on to say that Washington viewed the Declaration of Independence as an anti-slavery document, and that is what inspired him to free the people that he enslaved at the end of his life. A decade later, in 1848, William Lloyd Garrison, here in Boston at Faneuil Hall, tells the story to an anti-slavery crowd of a Southerner's will that was declared invalid, and the person who died, his will, he was declared insane because he chose to emancipate the people he enslaved in his will. And in this really dramatic moment, right, Garrison points to the giant portrait of Washington that's at the side of the stage, and he says, yells practically, he says, there is a man who was insane when he died. There stands George Washington, who by his will emancipated his slaves." And the crowd erupts in applause at this invocation of Washington. But the irony here is that at the very same moment that Garrison is talking about these things, his newspaper, The Liberator, sometimes from Garrison's pen, is really brutally criticizing Washington and is criticizing him for his involvement in slavery. Abolitionists throughout, especially the 1840s and 1850s, are constantly reminding their audience that George Washington lived and died a slaveholder, that he was a slaveholder to the day of his death. Right? And these abolitionists knew that these claims were radical. They knew exactly what they were doing in invoking Washington and kind of building it into their rhetorical repertoire in their speeches and writing against slavery. William Lloyd Garrison writes at one point, "In America, it is far more unpopular and hazardous to arraign the conduct of Washington than to speak against Jesus Christ." So he very much understands that criticizing Washington is this radical decision, and emphasizing his involvement with slavery is this radical decision, and that's why they do it, because they think it's going to be effective. They think it's going to drum up animosity towards slavery. They think it's going to become a point of conversation. Others were even more radical than William Lloyd Garrison, and for my money, no one has better barbs against Washington than the abolitionist Parker Pillsbury. He levies some of the most radical criticisms against Washington. He writes at one point and delivers in a speech calling Washington not only a slave holder, but a slave hunter because of his support of the first fugitive slave law in the 1790s, and especially for his efforts to recapture the self-emancipated woman Ona Judge. He says in another speech, quote, that Washington waited 8 years in blood to achieve his own liberty, and then went home and to the day of his death drove hundreds of his fellow men to unpaid and unpitied toil. In 1858, he tells a crowd, "If Washington should come down out of the clouds and become a slaveholder once again, before God, my country, and the world, I would pronounce him a traitor to the cause of freedom." Some of these things would be radical if you said them today, right? There was a lot of people who would not be happy with you if you talked about Washington this way, if you called him a traitor to the cause of freedom. So you can imagine what the public response was to an abolitionist like Parker Pillsbury saying something like that in the middle of the 19th century. But abolitionists weren't in agreement on how they could talk about Washington, and they were often just selectively kind of cherry-picking from Washington's ambiguous history with slavery in order to kind of levy the arguments that they thought would be most effective. So for some of them, that's lifting up Washington's emancipation. For others, it's implicating Washington as an active participant in the institution of slavery. At other times, they use Washington's leadership of the revolution and the violence inherent in the Revolutionary War to justify violent resistance to the slave power in the South, right? They talk about slave insurrections. They especially talk about John Brown, compare John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, compare him to Washington. You have one visitor to D.C. Who writes to the Liberator, and it gets published, says he's in D.C. seeing all of these statues of Washington, and he said he hopes all of them will be torn down and have the real Washington, or the modern Washington, John Brown, lifted up and memorialized instead. And sometimes, like in the case of William Lloyd Garrison, they kind of do all three at the very same time, depending on who they're talking to, what they felt like the moment called for. But abolitionists weren't the only ones invoking Washington in this way. Pro-slavery Southerners are also claiming Washington's legacy, which shows you kind of how ambiguous and how malleable Washington's history with slavery really was. So in 1850, John C. Calhoun, an aged John C. Calhoun, has to have a younger colleague read this speech into the Senate because he was too weak to do so. But he calls George Washington an illustrious Southerner. And he says, quote, "He was one of us, a slaveholder and a planter." In 1854, another pro-slavery advocate says, "General Washington, the father of his country, saw no crime and no peccadillo in holding slaves and making them work on his farm." So these pro-slavery speakers are pointing to Washington's history with slavery and saying, if Washington enslaved people, then that must be right, that must be fundamental to America, and that's why they wanted to continue it. In 1860, Lincoln calls these invocations of Washington sophistical contrivances, which if you ever need a stand-in for BS in polite conversation, I highly recommend sophistical contrivances. But he says that Americans needed to reject these efforts by pro-slavery Southerners to try to claim the mantle of Washington. He says that pro-slavery Southerners using Washington in this way is imploring men to unsay what Washington said and undo what Washington did. But undeterred, Lincoln gets elected president. Southern states, before he even comes into office, begin seceding from the Union, seceding from the United States to found a new republic dedicated to the institution of slavery. And a couple of years later, when they inaugurate the permanent government of the Confederacy in 1862, they do it in Richmond, Virginia, and they do it on George Washington's birthday, on February 22nd, 1862, and they do it in front of a giant statue of George Washington. President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, says that in establishing the government of the Confederacy and establishing this republic dedicated to slavery, they are, quote, carrying on the principles of our revolutionary fathers. They're doing it on Washington's birthday in front of this statue of Washington, and Davis says that their cause was, that the day and the setting was fitly associated with their cause, with the cause of slavery. You see George Washington right in the middle of the seal of the Confederate States of America. He gets put on Southern banknotes and Confederate currency. He's on the kind of at the top of the masthead images of Washington for Southern newspapers during the Civil War. So just as much as abolitionists were invoking Washington, pro-slavery Southerners are invoking Washington too. And it's these ambiguities in Washington's history with slavery and these unresolved tensions of Washington as both enslaver and emancipator that are at the heart of Washington's history with slavery, and they make him this endlessly flexible historical symbol for Americans to use, and today we see them continuing to use, however they see fit to make sense of the present or to make their arguments for various political or cultural causes. All of these discussions of Washington are grounded in this really selective reading of his history with slavery. Lifting him up as an enslaver or criticizing him as an enslaver or praising his emancipation requires that you block out all of the evidence that runs to the contrary. And with Washington, there's always some counterweight, right? There's always some other evidence that is going to oppose the argument that you're trying to make. And so it's never for these anti-slavery and pro-slavery speakers, it's never about understanding the history. It's always about winning the political and cultural battles of the day. And ultimately, there are no easy answers here, right? There's no piece of evidence that we're going to find that settles once and for all, this is how we should understand slavery's place in Washington's legacy. Washington, the heroic founder, Washington, the unrepentant enslaver, and Washington, the emancipator, are always going to exist side by side, and different people are going to understand different and lift up different aspects of that history in different ways. Ultimately, it's just an ambiguous history with the institution of slavery. But I genuinely think that there is power in embracing that ambiguity and leaning into that ambiguity. To do that, I think, is to recognize that America is not and has never been and will never be just one thing to all people. And our conversations about Washington are never just about Washington, right? They're always about America and what kind of country we are and who we are as a people. And I think leaning into that ambiguity is a really powerful way to at least understand how we should understand Washington in the present, at least come to talk about these things and to discuss them with honesty and in good faith. And I think at this unique historical moment, on the eve of our 250th anniversary, we have a really unique opportunity to step back and consider together what our history means to us now and what we want it to mean in the future. And I think through conversations with one another, through programs like this one, by doing that work together, leaning into that ambiguity together, I think we can better understand the past's most pressing questions, and it can help us collaborate to build a more just future. So I would be happy to answer questions. I know we're going to have a conversation. I'll have books outside, but thank you very much.
I think it's on. Can you hear me? Awesome. Thank you. Can we have another round of applause for our two presenters? I'm just going to jump right in and ask you both, why do you think so many Americans are unwilling to contend with the history of slavery or really talk about the legacies of slavery today? Both in actually Washington's lifetime, but then also today. Why is it still so hard?
I believe it's something that I believe it has been hard for people because it's something that we have never dealt with within our own families, like from the family unit on up to the governmental unit. We've never been able to truly discuss what has happened in our country and come to terms with it, reconcile with it, and therefore we haven't been able to move forward. Because of my husband being a therapist, I've been thinking about it recently, about how it seems like we all really need to have like a therapy session to really come to terms with what has happened in our country and get on the same page with what has happened in our country. Be honest about it, accept it, and then we could all move on. think about how we could move forward in understanding and dealing with what has happened under enslavement.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It was so surprising to me in doing the research how much Washington has just always kind of failed to be a human being for people, even while he was still alive, certainly in the years and centuries since his death. More than any other historical figure, Washington is not a real human being who had flaws and virtues. He is a symbol, and he's a symbol of America for people. And so people's assessment of Washington is kind of inextricably tied to their assessment of America. And for, I mean, history especially, it is so closely tied up with people's sense of their own identities and their community and who they are, that telling a different story about Washington means telling a different story about America. And that would demand that they tell a different story about themselves and understand who they are in a different way and understand who we are in a different way. And that's tough work, especially if you're not doing it kind of in community and if you're not doing it at a historic site or a museum. If you're just reading it in the news and trying to understand it for yourself, I think it's a lot easier to just reject it and say, that's not something I'm interested in doing right now. And it's mostly, to me, it's so much because Washington, it's not about doing history for people. It's not an academic exercise. It feels so personal to so many people because Washington has functioned as this symbol for so long.
So I want to pick up on this thread of symbolism because you both are historians and then you both are actually public historians, and we are, in the midst of all of the celebrations with way more to come in the summer around the 250th. So how do you both contend with people who are asking the question right now whether it's okay to commemorate the beginning of a nation that was born out of violence? And then given our political moment, is it okay to celebrate this today in the midst of a new form of political violence and racial violence that we're witnessing?
Yeah, I think it's, we're seeing, right, how challenging of a question that is. And, I've been working on the 250th and helping museums and historic sites think about how they're going to approach this anniversary since 2017. So I've been thinking about it a lot. And I think, there are so many different approaches to how to do this, and I don't think any of them are wrong necessarily, right? It's like I don't think we as historians need to be in the business of telling people this is how you should commemorate this anniversary any more than we would say, no, this is how you should celebrate, your birthday, or this is what your New Year's resolution should be, right? But I think where we run into challenges is people trying to do that and saying, no, that is not the right way to commemorate this anniversary. And we're seeing that happening with the power of the state behind it right now, of saying, no, there is one way to commemorate this anniversary, and it's by celebrating, American greatness. It's by celebrating American heroes. This is a big country with there are more than 21,000 history organizations in the United States. There are more history organizations than there are public libraries, thank you very much. And most of them are doing something for the 250th anniversary. I think there is space to do a lot of good and interesting work, and it's all contributing to this kind of broader understanding of what this nation is. But I'm also not, I don't think our organizations, I don't think we as historians can tell people this is how you should understand our history. This is the one way to do it. I think we have to make space for all of it. And I think there is space for all of it, and it'll be a richer commemoration for it if people can encounter these very different ways of looking at our history.
And I would like to add to that. I think the way that we can do it, the way I believe that I can do it, is to continue to educate people on what this 250th anniversary, why we're having this 250th anniversary, what this means, what the founding meant, what it may have meant to Black Americans, especially in my case. That's the one the one area where I was looking at what were Black Americans doing, what can we learn about what they were thinking from their writings from the very beginning up until today, for us to then consider, okay, how do we want to commemorate or not commemorate this anniversary? As John mentioned, I don't think it is our place to tell people how or if they should, but we can continue to educate them based on what we have learned, to share our knowledge so that they can make the decision for themselves on how they want to or not to commemorate this celebration.
Yeah, and so much of the best public history work right now, the work of museums and historical societies, is work that's happening in collaboration with communities. And so, I think listening to our neighbors and community members talking about what they want out of this anniversary, how they understand our history, and being there to provide context, to provide expertise, not just kind of making it a blank slate for people, but being there to say, to assist and to help people work through these questions. I don't think there's an answer to how do we reconcile the ideals of the American Revolution and our failure time and again to fully live up to them and make them reality for so many people in this country. But the process of exploring that question and exploring how it's developed over time, I think that makes for really rich and enlightening commemoration material.
There's so many questions that I want to ask you both, but I want to pick up off of a thread, Kelli, in which you were talking about, kind of centering the stories of Black Americans. And it's been making me think about Kelly Carter Jackson's book, We Refuse. And in it, she says, refusal is a forceful no. It is a no that is packed full of energy and meaning. Resistance to how one responds to white supremacy. Refusal is why it abhors oppression. It is a barrier that keeps oppressed people from being consumed. At its heart, refusal is collective. And I love that book, and I love her use of refusal. And then you mentioned your work on centering Black communities. Can you tell us how Black communities are actually refusing how they're remembered through the history of slavery, or demanding that they're put into the historical record? And what have you found through your research that helps us understand Black communities, Black movement, Black social institutions better?
The first community that comes to mind in Philadelphia is ATTACK, Avenging the Ancestors, which is the organization that was formed around the beginning of the President's House site, when they first learned that ground, what that ground was, and what the Park Service was attempting to do in negating the fact that the President's House site was there. They formed a coalition, and they have continued to do the work up until this day, especially recently with what happened at the President's House site. They were some of the first ones to come out and say no, and they continued to protest, and they filed lawsuits to make sure that vandalism, I call it, would stop and be reversed, and that the writing on the signs would not be changed, that the context around why the President's House is there and why we should continue to see it as a memorial is not changed. So that's one of the first, but I know that there are many other organizations in Philadelphia and elsewhere that are doing their own work of saying, we don't think instead of celebrating this year is also the 100th anniversary of Negro History Week and Black History Month. This year is also we had the birthday of Malcolm X recently. There are other things within the community that we would also like to celebrate, that lift up the freedom, the independence, and the continual fight that Black Americans are trying to push forward for their independence in this country that we also call our home.
That's amazing. I feel like it's always important to know what communities are doing on the ground. And John, I'm interested. I think Kelli, you bring up the work of descendants and your response just now. John, can you tell us the role of Black descendants in shaping the legacy of Washington, but then also how are Black people in the 19th and 20th century also evoking Washington's legacy to further their own political aims?
Yeah, I'll tell two stories. First is building on Kelli's comments about kind of commemoration and how the Black community is participating in these things. And I have a chapter in the book about the 1932 George Washington bicentennial. So it's the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birthday, and it's this huge nationwide commemoration, right? It really kind of sets the stage for the 1976 bicentennial and the 250th. They, for the first time, say, this all-white federal planning body says this is going to be 9 months long. We're not going to do this kind of big World's Fair thing where everyone comes to Virginia or to Philadelphia. It's going to be spread out, kind of grassroots all over the country. And so it's a huge deal. There's millions of programs, but they utterly erase and ignore Washington's history with slavery. But this is, the kind of the height of Jim Crow violence in the South. You have this really incredible generation of Black educators and activists, people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson, who are saying, no, if we're going to talk about Washington and if we're going to talk about him all year long, we have to emphasize his involvement with the institution of slavery. You have the Baltimore Afro-American, which is one of the most prominent Black newspapers in the country. They run headlines all year long that are really withering criticisms of Washington. Big bold letters that say George Washington, slave master. Headlines that say things like, George Washington whipped women on horseback until their blood ran. These really kind of lurid headlines. And you have this generation of Black activists and educators and writers who are doing this work during the Washington bicentennial as a way of making different arguments about the injustices and oppression of the Black present. And that's something that you've seen African Americans doing throughout American history. But to your other question about descendant communities, I think they're doing some of the most interesting work right now, and the involvement of the ways that museums and historic sites are involving descendant communities in their interpretation is really interesting. And so at Mount Vernon, they avoided talking about the institution of slavery for a very long time. And they've made a lot of progress in the last several decades. And a lot of that work in the last 10 or 15 years has been in collaboration with descendants of people who were enslaved at Mount Vernon. And so they've done things like, collaborated on a major exhibit about slavery at Mount Vernon. They've done a podcast together. They've done an audio tour where descendants are giving voice to people who were enslaved at Mount Vernon. And I think to Mount Vernon's credit, they have, worked really closely with these people in order to shape the way that they tell the history of slavery at the site. But I also, I thank Mount Vernon because they encouraged me they're like, you need your own relationship with the descendants. And I got to speak to 5 of them that I interviewed for the book, and am really honored that they trusted me and had faith in me to kind of tell their stories. And many of them are still not satisfied with the way that Mount Vernon is telling this story. They still want to be there, kind of pushing them to do more. And I don't know how Mount Vernon would be approaching it if it wasn't for their involvement with the descendant community. But it's, I think, really encouraging to see them taking on that active role and actively involving descendants in that process. And Doug Bradburn will be here next month. And you can ask him.
So I was really moved, Kelli, when you put up your research on the Black community and you had the maps up, and you showed where people were living. My family, half of my family lives in Philadelphia, the other half lives in New Jersey. And so, Philadelphia is a very historic city. You know that there's history, all throughout the streets. But there's something special about the creation of like maps and walking tours and how it makes this history accessible. Once you're finished with that project, like how do you hope that communities will use it?
I hope that people would take it and continue to do their own research. And similar to what I did for the initial map that's on nps.gov, it could be turned into a walking tour. It could be a self-guided walking tour. Park rangers also can create their own walking tours sometimes, depending on their collateral duty and what they're allowed to do. I think that's the right term. So I use this, and I'm creating this for people to take it and run with it. It's to me, I see it as I would say a second step, because it started with Dr. Billy Smith and Paul Sivett's team, who collected all of the data from the 1789 tax list, the 1790 census, and the 1791 city directory, and put it into the initial data, which is on UPenn's website. They can see it. Anyone can see it. And I then took the second step to pull out all of the free black heads of households and all of the white enslavers who had free or enslaved people in their households. And I put that into a spreadsheet, and that's what I want to make a map of, because I've always loved plans and maps, very visual, to actually see who was all around the president's house, and to actually name them, and to see what occupation they had, right along with their the indentured or the free German immigrant who may have lived next door to them or lived on the second floor of their own house. They were all in that community together. And that was one thing, looking back at older literature for Independence National Historical Park, I noticed that Black American people weren't even mentioned as being in the community. And that really struck me and stayed with me. And I know it's different now. I know that they tell different stories now in the park, but it would be nice to see that in the literature, and I thought it would be nice for visitors and for the general public to see that, yes, they all lived amongst one another. It was not the segregated neighborhoods that we now see in Philadelphia.
Yeah, and Kelli deserves so much credit for doing that work, because I know how hard it is to do that kind of painstaking data collection and looking at manuscript censuses and city directories. I did some similar work for Free Black Charlestonians for my first book, and that is like really painstaking work. And so kudos, getting those dots on the map is not as easy as putting dots on a map. But one thing that that I think about when I look at a map like that and think about how I would use it is, when, Hercules leaves, the cook that Washington enslaved leaves the president's house, and he goes left or right. Who is he passing on his kind of walk through the neighborhood, right? These are people who, until Washington becomes president, lived almost the entirety of their lives at Mount Vernon in rural Virginia. And suddenly they are members of the largest free black community in the United States. And how transformative that is for them really kind of comes alive when you think about, just walking around the block, they're going to see free black heads of households. They're going to see property owners, people who own businesses. Washington's kind of enslaved sort of personal valet William Lee, Washington calls him Billy in most of his records. And then he writes a letter to someone shortly after coming back from Philadelphia with Lee, and he says that, my boy Billy has taken to calling himself William Lee. It's this like really transformative experience for him where he comes into his own identity. Hercules, the cook that he enslaved, becomes known throughout the city for kind of buying this like ostentatious clothing, and suddenly he has access to black tailors and black seamstresses and and black barbers, and it transforms his personal style, right? And they have access to these things that they just don't at a place like Mount Vernon, and being able to point to those spots on the map and say, this is their world. This is the world that they lived in. They would have known these people. They would have passed these people every day. I think really takes those, painful to find manuscript data points and, really helps you envision a story with them.
Yeah, and that makes me think too. The other idea when you first asked me the question, there's a group called 1838 Black Metropolis that does walking tours in Philadelphia. Having something, a group like that to take on this work, and even broader than that or bigger than that, I love the show The Gilded Age. To see Black Philadelphia on the screen, just as they've done Black New York and Black New England, I think would also be amazing.
Okay, I can talk to you both forever, but we should open it up to some audience questions. If you all have any questions for our panelists, I think they would be more than happy to answer them.
Yes, I have a question for John about the cover of the book. Could you give us a little bit further explanation on the graphic that was chosen? I'm trying to see the detail of it. It's hard to tell from.
It's hard to tell the detail on the graphic that was selected for the book, and why was it selected?
Yeah, so make this interactive. Go back. This image in particular, this one is another from the same series, and this one is Washington's will, where he is emancipating the people that he enslaved. And it's a reproduction of that document that is shredded and put over top, literally nailed over top of it. It's a mixed media, kind of three-dimensional piece. But the cover of the book... this one is the runaway ad that Washington places for Ona Judge. It's a reproduction of that that he shreds and puts over top of it. And I just, he does this with some other historical figures too. You got a sense of some of the other art in his series through, that was in Kelly's presentation. But I just love the way it juxtaposes this like very traditional view of Washington with this much more abstract sense of, how does that picture literally transform when you put the history of slavery front and center and literally nail it over the top of Washington's face. I'll close this and make my stuff disappear. Yes.
I'm struck by just the depth of all this information that is just totally opposite with what happened when I went to school 100 years ago. I'm wondering, my question is around how you get this information into school curriculums. I would assume Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, some places are rather enlightened in terms of what children are taught. But what I hear about Florida is their efforts are kind of going in a totally different direction. And I'm wondering, how do you kind of let other people know all of these things that you've been uncovering, both of you?
Doing talks like this is one way that I, especially since the NPS terminated their grant agreement with Mellon, doing talks like this is one way that I am continuing to let people know that the Invisible Architects of Freedom Digital Archive is still available at nps.gov. And social media is another way. And just to back up, the National Park Service and Independence already had a relationship with the school district of Philadelphia. They have had it for many, many years. So, but it had waned a little bit, especially since the school district did not have a social studies curriculum director for like 9 years. So one of the thoughts that they had when I started as a Mellon postdoc was to try to reestablish the relationship with the school district of Philadelphia, based on what they had done with the school district in the past. So I would say for historic sites and for other and for individuals that are interested, if they can, I mean, cold calling or cold emailing or just reaching out to see how you could help and how you could partner, I think is also beneficial, because many people are often looking for the resources. They just may not know where to look or know what's available. So that's what I have found in the past few years. That's what I've learned.
Yeah, and it's a great and really important question. I have a whole chapter of the book about how Washington and slavery kind of plays out in school curriculum, mostly focused on how these conversations play out in the 1960s, but also in kind of the history wars of the 1990s, and then the fights over the APUSH curriculum in the 2010s, and now with kind of current curriculum battles. And in the state of Florida, it's really interesting, their 2023 revision to their high school social studies curriculum talks about Washington and slavery, but it only talks about his emancipation of the people that he enslaved, right? It places Washington alongside abolitionists and Mumbet Freeman, who sues and gains her liberty through the courts in Massachusetts and helps bring an end to slavery here. And so Washington is placed alongside them, kind of only lifting up this emancipation and saying, yes, we are a nation dedicated to human liberty, right? And that's kind of the story that they want to tell. And but it's been a fight for forever, since the earliest kind of school textbooks in the early 19th century, as curriculums start getting standardized. It's been a fight then. It was a fight then, and it's still a fight now. And I think having sites of informal education become even more important. Having museums and historical societies and historic sites who are able to do this work, especially in this moment, private nonprofit museums and historic sites who are able to do that kind of work and tell those stories. They are these spaces of informal education that become even more important in a moment like the one we're in now, not just for current school children, but for adults who maybe didn't learn this history when they were in school, to give them a new opportunity to think about these histories in new ways.
I would add to that too, the one other group that I realized we had not been paying attention to was the homeschool community, the homeschool associations, and trying to reach out to them as well to let them know what is available.
I think we have time for one last question, if anyone has.
The question was, what happened to Ona?
You want to take this one?
So when she left the Washington's house, if you want to know the whole story, Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar has written a book, Never Caught.
Yeah, you can read it tomorrow.
Yes, you could. It's
got
out.
Narrative propulsion, as they say.
And there's a is it young adult or is it children? Okay, there's a young adult version as well. She tells a whole story in there, but very briefly, she walked out of the Washington's house at 6th and Market, and she went into the Black American community. She had already, somehow or another, sent her items out, like all of the belongings that she wanted to take with her, she had already given to friends that she had made within the Black community of Philadelphia. She left the house at dinner time. They got her to the Delaware River, and from my understanding, she made her way up to New Hampshire. Washington continued to pursue her for like 7 years? Years. But he never was able to find her. I believe they did locate her at one point in time. He sent someone up there to meet.
He sends an agent up there, but says, don't incite a mob or a riot when you do it. Like, if that's what it takes, then you have to back down.
And she said, no, I'm not going back. So he left her. He left her there because he did not want to incite anything. She got married. She had children. She passed away.
She tells her whole story to a newspaper in New Hampshire that kind of lays all this out. But if you want a much better version of that of this, read Erica Armstrong Dunbar's book, Never Caught. It's incredible.
Well, thank you both so much for this amazing conversation. They will both be sticking around. John will be outside signing books.
I have books for sale. If this is interesting to you, I hope you'll consider picking up the book.
And thank you all for being here tonight. Can we give them one more last?